Trieu Duong stood in the middle of the busy market, quietly selling bundles of fresh vegetables with one hand, while the other never left Truc Lam held safely against his chest. Every coin he received wasn't just money, it was milk, diapers, and a little more comfort for his daughter. In that moment, he made a simple promise to himself. No matter how hard the day gets, everything he does is to protect her. But after this long day, can he bring everything she needs back home before night falls? If this story touches your heart, leave a comment below. The morning light hadn't fully settled yet, but the soft golden glow was already slipping through the gaps in the wooden walls. It was the kind of quiet, gentle morning that made everything feel slower, warmer. Inside the small house, Baby Truc Lam had just finished her milk, her tiny hand still resting against the bottle, as if she didn't want to let it go. Trieu Duong sat beside her, watching closely the way he always did, not just to make sure she finished eating, but to make sure she was okay. His hand gently supported her back, steady and protective, as he lifted her up against his chest. He softly patted her back, waiting for that small, familiar sound, a tiny burp. He smiled immediately, relief and warmth spreading across his face. "That's my girl," he whispered, his voice low and calm. Truc Lam blinked slowly, her eyes looking up at him, still a little sleepy, still a little unsure of the world, but completely safe in his arms. For a moment, nothing else mattered, but mornings didn't wait. Trieu Duong carefully wrapped her in a light cloth, making sure her body stayed warm but comfortable. He adjusted the fabric gently around her head, shielding her from the breeze. Every movement was slow, deliberate, like he was handling something far more fragile than anything else in the world, because to him, she was. He stepped outside, holding her close to his chest. The fresh air carried the scent of soil, grass, and the faint dampness from the night before. It was the kind of smell that meant a new day had begun. Before anything else, he had responsibilities. With one arm holding Truc Lam securely, he moved toward the small animal area beside the house. The chickens were already awake, clucking softly, waiting. The goats shifted restlessly, their eyes following him. "Wait a little," he murmured, half to them, half to himself. He set down a small basket, quickly scattering feed for the chickens. They rushed forward, pecking eagerly. Then he moved to the goats, placing fresh grass in front of them, making sure everything was enough, making sure they wouldn't go hungry while he was gone. Even in these small tasks, he never rushed, because in one arm was his whole world. Truc Lam stirred slightly, her tiny fingers pressing lightly against his shirt. He instinctively adjusted his hold, pulling her closer, one hand gently covering her back, as if shielding her from everything around. "It's okay. Baba's here," he whispered again. Only after everything was settled did he move toward the small garden behind the house. Rows of greens stretched out quietly under the morning light. This was where their food came from. This was where their days began. And today, this was what he would bring to the market. He crouched down slowly, careful not to disturb the baby in his arms. With one hand, he reached out and began picking fresh vegetables. Leafy greens first, selecting only the best ones. Each leaf was checked, cleaned lightly, and placed into the basket beside him. Truc Lam watched. Her eyes, still new to everything, followed every movement. The rustling leaves, the shifting light, the gentle rhythm of her father working. It wasn't just farming. It was the first world she was seeing. Trieu Duong noticed her gaze and smiled softly. "You're watching, huh?" he said quietly. He lifted a small bunch of greens slightly closer to her, letting her see. Not too close, just enough. His movements were always careful, always thoughtful, like he was introducing her to life one small moment at a time. After finishing with the vegetables, he moved to the cucumber patch. The vines stretched low across the ground, dotted with fresh cucumbers hidden beneath the leaves. He gently pushed the leaves aside, selecting the firmest ones, twisting them free with practiced ease. Each one landed softly in the basket. Each one meant something, because this wasn't just food. This was what would become milk for her. Diapers, small things she needed to grow. He glanced down at her again, still watching, still calm, still trusting, and that look made every bit of effort worth it. The basket slowly filled, greens on one side, cucumbers on the other. Not too much, just enough for the day. Trieu Duong stood up carefully, adjusting the weight of both the basket and the baby in his arms. He checked the cloth around her again, making sure it wasn't too tight, not too loose. The sun was climbing higher now. Time was moving. He walked back toward the house briefly, grabbing a few simple things, an extra cloth, a small bottle just in case. Every decision he made was built around one question. Will she be okay? Only when he was sure, truly sure, did he step out toward the path leading to the market. The road wasn't smooth, it never was. Dirt, small stones, uneven patches. It was a path shaped by years, not comfort. But Trieu Duong walked it steadily, each step measured, each movement controlled to keep Truc Lam from being disturbed. She rested quietly against him now, her head leaning lightly into his chest. With every step he took, she felt the gentle rhythm of his breathing, the steady beat of his heart. It was enough to keep her calm. It was enough to keep her safe. Along the way, the village slowly came to life. A few people passed by, some carrying baskets, some leading bicycles. They glanced at him, at the baby in his arms, at the basket in his hand. Some smiled, some nodded. They all understood without words. A young father doing everything he could. Trieu Duong didn't say much. He simply nodded back politely, his focus never leaving the small life he carried. Every now and then, he adjusted her position slightly, making sure her neck was supported, her body comfortable. When the sunlight grew stronger, he shifted the cloth a bit more to shield her face. Even the smallest change mattered. Even the smallest discomfort, he noticed. Because protection for him wasn't a big action. It was 1,000 small ones. Step by step, they moved closer to the market. The sounds grew louder. Voices, movement, the low hum of people beginning their day. It was a different world compared to the quiet of the morning at home. Trieu Duong slowed slightly. He looked down at Truc Lam. She'll be okay, he reassured himself softly. Then tightening his hold just a little, not out of fear, but out of instinct, he stepped forward into the market, a place full of noise. But in his arms, there was still calm. The market was already alive. Voices overlapped, footsteps moved quickly, and the air carried a mix of scents, fresh vegetables, damp earth, and the faint smell of cooked food from nearby stalls. It was busy, a little chaotic, the complete opposite of the quiet morning Truc Lam had just come from. But in Trieu Duong's arms, she remained calm. He stepped carefully through the narrow paths between stalls, his eyes constantly scanning, not for customers first, but for space. Enough space so no one would brush too close. Enough distance so nothing would startle her. Only when he found a small, open spot did he finally stop. He crouched down slowly, placing the basket of vegetables in front of him. With one hand, he adjusted the cloth around Trieu Khang again, gently shielding her from the brighter light in the movement around them. "You stay here with Baba," he whispered softly. She blinked, her eyes moving slowly, taking everything in, but never straying too far from his face. That connection never broke. Trieu Duong began arranging the vegetables. The leafy greens were placed neatly in small bundles, the cucumbers lined up beside them. Simple, clean, and honest, just like the effort behind them. People passed by. Some slowed down. Some stopped. "How much for this?" one asked, pointing at the cucumbers. Trieu Duong answered calmly, his voice steady but gentle. He wasn't loud, wasn't pushy. He didn't need to be, because what he carried spoke louder than anything. A baby in one arm, work in the other. A quiet kind of responsibility that people could feel without explanation. A few customers noticed Trieu Lam and smiled. "She's so small." He nodded, a faint smile appearing. "Yes, still very small." Every time someone stepped a little too close, his body shifted slightly, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but always placing himself between them and her. Not aggressive, just instinct, just protection. The sales were slow at first. A bundle here, a few cucumbers there, nothing rushed, nothing forced. But Trieu Duong didn't look impatient, because every time he looked down at Trieu Lam and saw her resting peacefully, it reminded him why he was here in the first place. Not just to sell, but to provide. Time passed quietly. The basket slowly became lighter. The sun climbed higher, and little by little the vegetables were gone. By late morning, only a few pieces remained. Trieu Duong gathered them together, selling the last bits at a lower price. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he had done enough. He counted the money briefly, just a quick glance, nothing more, and tucked it carefully into his pocket. His other hand immediately returned to supporting Trieu Lam's back. Always back to her, always. He looked up at the sky. The light had changed slightly. Time was moving faster now. "We should go," he murmured. But before heading home, there was one more stop. He adjusted the basket, now much lighter, and began walking again, moving away from the noise of the market and toward a small supermarket not too far away. The road there was quieter, less crowded, but the sun was stronger now, casting a sharper light across the ground. Trieu Duong shifted the cloth again, making sure it shaded Trieu Lam's face. He angled his body slightly as he walked, using himself to block the sunlight from reaching her directly. Each step was small, measured, careful. When they finally reached the supermarket, he paused briefly at the entrance. The cool air inside was different, cleaner. Still, he stepped in slowly. Inside, everything felt more structured. Rows of products, clear aisles, a kind of order that didn't exist outside. But Trieu Duong didn't linger. He knew exactly what he needed. Milk powder, diapers, a few small baby essentials, nothing extra. He moved through the aisles with quiet focus, one hand holding Trieu Lam, the other reaching carefully for each item. Even when grabbing things from the shelf, his movement stayed controlled, never sudden. He placed the items into a small basket, checked them once, then headed to the counter. While waiting, he gently adjusted Trieu Lam's position again, letting her rest more comfortably against his chest. His fingers lightly tapped her back in a soft rhythm, just enough to keep her calm, just enough to remind her he was there, always there. The cashier glanced at him, then at the baby, and gave a small, knowing smile. Trieu Duong returned it quietly. No words were needed. Once everything was paid for, he stepped back outside. The difference in temperature was immediate. The afternoon sun had taken over. Stronger now. He looked up again. The sky was beginning to shift, still bright, but slowly preparing for evening. And the distance home was not short. Trieu Duong tightened his hold slightly, not in panic, but in awareness. "We need to go now," he said softly. The path back felt longer. The weight in his arms hadn't changed, but the time pressure had. Each step carried a quiet urgency now, not rushing wildly, but no longer slow. Because one thought stayed in his mind: before dark. He adjusted the bag of supplies on one side, making sure it didn't swing too much. His other arm held Trieu Lam securely, her body pressed gently against him. She had grown quieter, more still, maybe tired, maybe drifting towards sleep. Her small breast brushed lightly against his chest, steady and soft. Trieu Duong lowered his head slightly, his cheek almost touching her head. "It's okay. We're going home," he whispered. The road seemed longer than before. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched. Every few steps he checked her position again. Her head, her back, the cloth around her. No detail was too small. No moment was ignored. Because for him, getting home wasn't just about distance. It was about getting her back safely, completely. Finally, the familiar outline of their home appeared in the distance. Simple, quiet, waiting. Trieu Duong didn't slow down, but something in his expression softened. Relief. Real, deep relief. When he stepped into the yard, the sounds changed again. The animals stirred lightly. The air felt familiar. Safe. He exhaled quietly. "We made it," he said under his breath. Inside, he moved quickly but gently, placing the supplies down, setting everything aside for later. None of that mattered right now. He carefully laid Trieu Lam down on a soft cloth, adjusting it around her body. She stirred slightly, then settled, still calm, still safe. Trieu Duong sat beside her for a moment, his hand resting lightly on her chest, feeling the small, steady rise and fall of her breathing. The day had been long, the road had been hard, but she was here, warm, safe, and that was enough. More than enough. He looked at her quietly, a faint smile returning, not from ease, not from rest, but from something deeper. A quiet kind of pride, a quiet kind of love, the kind that didn't need to be spoken. Because everything he did today, every step, every effort, every careful movement, was already saying it. After a peaceful morning feeding Trieu Lam, Trieu Duong carries her outside, gently holding her close as he finishes daily chores, feeding chickens and goats before heading to the garden. With one arm protecting his daughter, he carefully picks fresh vegetables and cucumbers to sell at the market. Throughout the journey, Trieu Lam stays quietly in his arms, watching the world with trust and calm. At the busy market, he sells just enough to earn money for her needs, then stops by a small supermarket to buy milk, diapers, and baby essentials. But on the way back, the sun begins to set faster than expected. Holding her tighter, Trieu Duong walks steadily, focused on one thing: getting his daughter home safely before dark.